right. So, as you guys already know, for my project, I already decided to do a bamboo fly rod. So my initial project vision was to encompass a few elements. This is a project that I'd had in sort of my back pocket for years, and just this was a great sort of synergistic opportunity to fabricate it. My goal was to create a rod that balanced the function elements in terms of something I can actually go use. It's not just an art piece. And what I called the naturalist aesthetic, which incorporated some elements of organic design with the materials and the shape and the textures, but also a tribute to the arts and crafts side of it relative to when people used to actually make these by hand and fabricate them because it was the only technology they had available. My initial project budget was $100 to $200, and I sort of punched straight through that ceiling, but we'll get to that a little later. So my design process I broke down into three key phases. You guys sort of saw my works like prototype, which was $10 and made out of like tape and garden stakes. I actually caught a fish on it that weekend, so it worked. Next, it was to specify my aesthetic goals and then match those with materials that I could source, in a couple of weeks, so online or locally. And I got most of my components online from one store, the Angler's Roost. They specialize in bamboo rod kits, so I got the blanks and then all the components, and I tried to match as much of it as I could with my intended aesthetic, but some things like the stripping guides I couldn't get in any colors other than stainless steel or black. So it was a balance there. And then lastly, just the fabrication of the final design. It was very much a learning curve throughout. There was lots of oversights on my part, which just resulted in extra time. So project summary. On the financial side, like I said, my budget was supposed to be $100 to $200. The actual expenses was just north of $200 between the works like prototype, the rod components, and the actual fabrication equipment. And the total time to fabricate, I say 25 to 30 hours. It might actually have been more than that, but I would say 80% of that time went into wrapping all the components with the thread. And a lot of that I just did I did like one per night in front of the TV before going to bed. It was the only way to keep my sanity. And the components consisted of the rod blanks, the reel seat, the handle, the stripping guides. The ferrules are basically what connect the rod to the two pieces of the rod together in the middle, and just all the components, the thread, the finish, to actually fabricate it all together. So I'm going to go ahead and pass these around as I go through the fabrication. So this is obviously the base, and then this is one of the finish tips. What was awesome is that when you bought a set of blanks, they would send you 2 tips for the bamboo in case you break one. You're not totally out of luck. So here, it's 8 feet long, so it's sort of a pain. We can put it together at the end if we want. So the first step in the fabrication process was finding the spine of the rod, which was a really quick step. It was basically, since they're visually symmetrical, you have to figure out which way the rod is intended to bend. So the way you do that is by bending it ever so gently and then rolling it in your fingers. And as we're passing these around, feel free to do this gently. And you can actually feel which way it gives naturally and which way it resists naturally. And then when you do that each time, you would mark it with your pencil, do it again, mark it with your pencil, and then figure out which side had the most marks, hopefully all of the marks, and that's where you put all your guides and your components. So that tip is finished. This one's not, and I sort of intentionally stopped where I am because you can see the threads aren't finished with the epoxy, and neither is the tip top stripping guide. Feel free to look at that as well. The next step was to attach the reel seat, or after finding the spine, you would figure out the dimensions, which I just used from the references on the website for all of the locations for the reel seat, the handle, all the guides, relative to how long the rod was and what type of weight it was. So after I marked all those, I attached the reel seat and the cork handle, where you would just measure them, place them, and then use epoxy to set them. Next was the wrapping of all the stripping guides, the hook keeper, which, like I mentioned, took the majority of the time on the fabrication process. I realized this once I started looking up the sort of how-to videos, that all the pros, they have a stand, which really helps you get a nice clean wrap and helps you do it much more quickly because it can keep things in position. I did it all by hand, which took forever, because if I was halfway through a wrap and the threads got crossed up and it snapped, you'd have to take it all off. And it's hard to tell, but there's probably a couple hundred wraps on each one of those red blobs of thread. Next was fitting, gluing, and wrapping the ferrules, so that's just what goes on the end. Another thing that I would do differently is that the blanks, they come too wide for the ferrules that go on the end, so I had to sort of file it really slowly and methodically to keep it symmetrical, because once I did it a little cockeyed, then I had to file it down and then do it again. So next time I would put it into a lathe and then turn it down to the correct diameter so it'd be symmetrical. And then the last step was just the finishing process, which I sort of bootstrapped as well. I used clear epoxy, and then since it was a 5-minute epoxy, I went through lots of 99-cent paintbrushes because it was drying faster than I could actually paint it on. So I just mix up a little epoxy and then apply it to the wraps, and then in 5 to 10 minutes it would dry and it's nice and clear. And it really, I wanted to use a clear epoxy because then you could actually see the wraps of the thread while it still is protected and robust. So as far as my functional and artistic goals, I have yet to test the rod because I finished it like 5 days ago, but I would really like to this weekend. If I'm able to find the spare time, go try it out on the water. And all the rod's components seem to function as intended. Relative to my artistic goal, I'm very pleased with how the overall aesthetic turned out. I had to make some compromises in terms of the components that I could readily source, and I also made a couple tweaks. For instance, like the ferrules had a really bright chrome finish on them, so I just took a really fine sandpaper and dusted off all that chrome so that it has a little bit more of like an opaque look and less of a machined and chromed out look. I do think that I captured the naturalist aesthetic I was striving for with the organic design elements. I really like these blanks because they were hex-shaped instead of round, and all of the nice sleek nature and the sort of organic flow of the rod, I think, really helped to encompass that, as well as the arts and crafts. I really learned a lot about the process because every time I would run into an issue, I would look up another video, another tutorial, another website of these guys who are pros doing this for 40, 50 years. And the main challenge was not having the right equipment, but also there was a lot of learning in that struggle, so I really appreciate that as well. So lessons learned and design improvements for a future iteration. I think that initially, I had considered trying to source a reel that could match the aesthetic. I had a lot of trouble with that because all the ones that I found were custom and were way outside of my price range. So even with one of the reels I already had, I still think that that's something I can do later and it doesn't really detract from the overall aesthetic or functionality. Next time, I would add the handle and the reel seat, specifically the reel seat last, and I'll show you why. Because it added extra weight during the wrapping process with all this metal and cork on the bottom when I was trying to turn all the wraps. It was just extra weight on the bottom, so I was constantly fighting it on this piece. And also, if you guys look, you can see that my reel seat twisted after I glued it in, because if this would be sort of straight, it's a little hard to tell, but it's ever so slightly, you can see it's like a little cockeyed. So that means that if I was holding it straight, you could see it's ever so slightly off to the side. So too late now, it's just a little quirk of the rod. I don't think it'll affect anything negatively. And I'd mentioned turning the end of the blanks for mounting the ferrules just so they're symmetric and I don't have to file it and then refile it and then keep checking it. That was a really slow, arduous process. And the correct rod fabrication equipment would have accelerated the whole process as a whole, but considering this was a one-off, I just decided to do it by hand. And here's an example of those stands are that I'm talking about. It just holds all your thread and it keeps it symmetrical and helps with the process and the overall visual. Up next, finish fabricating the extra tip. I wanted to leave it sort of as is so you guys could see it in interim, but then finishing that just so I have it back up and then trying it out on the water, which is what I'm most excited for. Thanks for your attention. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
How strong are these tips? Like, how easily could they break if, you get like a 15-pound fish or something?
So they make them in a whole variety that matches like standard rods. So my standard rod that I use is 9 feet and 5 weight. So the higher the weight, the more like robust it is. Okay. It's 9 feet 5 weight. This is 8 feet and 4 weight. So it's one step below, which was intentional because it's just a different type of rod. But you could fish this in like any stream around Colorado.
Okay.
Yeah.
So once you're at the lake, what do? You just connect it and run the string through, and then you're good to go?
Yeah, I mean that's really it. It's all done, and with the reel on there, it's just like a normal rod.
Okay.
Connect it up now. That's really all it is, and then you tie your fly on and get busy.
Normally, when you have these fly rods, you wouldn't have, like, it's always disconnected right there like that. Like, you wouldn't carry that long thing around.
Yeah, and they come in single pieces, which I've never seen people use, and they come in 2 pieces, and what's most common is actually 4. So you can imagine it's chopped into 4s, because then it's like small, and you can put it in a backpack. And that's what like all my other rods are.
Okay.
So here you can see it's sort of in one piece, and it's got good action. As far as I can tell, it's functional, and I'm definitely excited to go actually give it a try.
So you were saying the reel ended up a little off center, but another comment was that you could replace the reel at some point. Is it possible to resituate that one? Or I guess I didn't understand the process of
So the reel isn't permanently attached. Like I just pulled this off my other rod this morning. How the reel seat works is it's just a collar and like a recess, so it just is that sort of profile. And you just seat it in and slide it forward, and then slide this collar up, and then screw it on. So everything's removable. It's the actual reel seat that's like 10 or 15 degrees sort of cockeyed off center, and I don't think that'll affect anything. I'm not a good enough angler where I could even possibly notice that.
That's awesome. Gotcha.
And maybe it would be if I wanted to, and I don't think I'll want to.
For sure.
Redo the reel seat because it's all epoxy together, so you'd have that be like a lot of work.
You need a really good heat gun for that, or I don't know what. What do reels usually cost? Like I'm sure it's very different.
Yeah, just like all sporting equipment, there's super low end to super high end. The low end ones that I had sort of looked at just for the sake of conveying the aesthetic, it's like if I want to invest in a reel, I want it to be good. And the ones that I was looking at, it's like they would be almost identical to this one, but like a different color. So for the sake of the aesthetic, it didn't match the cost benefit.
And what's the price of those usually?
All the way from like $30-40 up to $500-600. It just like all sporting equipment, there's a huge range. Like that's probably a $100 reel.
Awesome.
Any other questions, guys?
It looks really good, and I actually think like the metal looks fine with this aesthetics because it like pops out with all the other metal pieces, so it doesn't look like foreign. Like I don't think it looks.
Yeah, that was, and like I said, it became from a stretch goal to just like an almost immediate no-go once I started looking at the components and cruising around to figure out what existed. I saw some custom patterns that were, $400 or $500 that were like really beautiful because they had the custom pattern on the machined parts, which is like it's beautiful, but wasn't within the scope of this project. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe the next one.
I also like the way the epoxy looks on the red.
Yeah.
It's like a nice shiny but smooth looking. I think it looks good.
Yeah, next time, I don't know if I would have done the 5-minute epoxy because my goal was that I didn't have to sit there because in order to keep it symmetrical or in an attempt to keep it symmetrical, basically I would paint a few of them and then I would turn it so that the epoxy would dry in like a nice even coat, and you'd have to with those stands you can motorize it and it'll do it for hours with like a long cure epoxy, which would have made it easier than like the 10-minute epoxy I was using, but I was balancing the sort of cost benefit there. I didn't want to sit there on my couch for hours turning this thing.
Per each one.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you guys.
Is anyone else going today?